Howdy, and welcome to the F1 Hatchet. And what a beautiful day for a sprint race. A nice, partly cloudy day with the sun shining down on the track. Not quite as cool as I would have liked, especially since the qualifying session was a nice, cloudy day that kept everything nice and cool. So the sun was out, warmed up the track, gave the track a little bit of different, interactions and tractions for the sprint race. Plus, we had the Ferraris battling out, which I really enjoyed, with Carlos Sainz trying to make his way up to the first position. And then we had Oscar Piastri making his way from the back of the field after messing up the qualifying session. So, in all, it was a really good race. I really enjoyed it. I think it was one of the best sprint races that I've seen. Even though, Max Verstappen, did the full thing out in front without too much to worry about. I think the whole sprint race itself, with all the action behind it, made up for all of that fun stuff. So, without further ado, I start from the back of the grid and work my way up and try to give you a little bit of information on each driver, if I know what happened to them and what kind of things they happened. So, here we are with Valtteri Bottas in the last place. He qualified in 18th, ended up in 20th. He was doing not as good as he was hoping to with those upgrades from that Stake Salver Kick F1 car. But it got worse on that last lap when his brakes failed and he was have to pull over and probably destroyed some components in that Stake F1 car that they're going to have to go figure out how to replace and fix. But that kind of dropped him back into that 20th position. Then we have his teammate, of course, Juan Zhou, who qualified in 19th and ended up in 19th at the back of the grid. Not a whole lot to say about him or the stakes besides the issues that they're having, not being able to really get the updates they need. And that puts a lot of pressure on Audi as they're trying to come in and take over that team next year. Fernando Alonso had a horrible day. He qualified in 14th and ended up in 18th. He lost 2 positions at the first start of the race. He did pass Liam Lawson on lap 8 for 16th position, but then just started falling back from there. I did not hear exactly if something else happened to that Aston Martin that dropped him farther back into the grid, but I wouldn't be surprised if something else happened to him to drop that far back. Alexander Albon qualified in 18th position, but started off in 20th position due to changes to his car during the Parc Fermé, so he had to start from the pit row. And so started him off in 20th, made his way up to 17th. Just kind of a normal day, not the greatest for the Williams, trying to run through this sprint race. Hopefully they got some information that they could use for the GP race tomorrow. Liam Lawson started off his F1 career formally and started off in 15th position and dropped back to 16th. I know he was struggling a little bit, trying to get his hands around that RB and that technical issues that he was having with it not being quite as to his liking. But he was getting what he needed to do, get done, and learning the tracks and learning how to proceed. I don't have a whole lot else for him in general, besides him passing Alonso on lap 8 for that 16th position. Then we have Esteban Ocon, who qualified in 17th and made his way up to 15th. I don't have any kind of passing. Somehow I missed all these actions on track. And Pierre Gasly was the same way, except he kind of dropped back from 12th to 14th. He did lose a position at the start of the race. The Alpine's not quite where they wanted to be in that new paint scheme. It sounds like they're doing a little bit better for the qualifying session, so hopefully they can get a good showing for the GP race. Lance Stroll did his normal, qualified in 13th and ended up in 13th, even though he gained a position at the start of the race, so he lost that during the sprint race itself, going back to the spot where he started off in. And I'm not sure if it's the Aston Martins that are really struggling lately, or if it's the drivers in that setup just falling behind the rest of the field because of the improvements from the rest of the field. But they need to do some work to get back into things so they can get some more points and put more pressure on the front runners. Franco did a fairly good job outbeating his teammate in qualifying and qualified in 10th. Dropped down to 12th, but did a decent job. Overall, I think it was him learning this track and everything else as a rookie coming in at the last minute again, doing a good job in that Williams, and kind of shows you where he stands. Makes some interesting developments may come because of some weird language that it's coming out saying that it's better for him to have a ride in 2025 than Williams to lose points due to it. So I'm not sure exactly what to make of that statement, but Franco is doing a good job. And with Carlos coming in next year alongside Alex, we'll have to see how that battle will come around. Yuki was struggling a little bit. I know he was having some good battles in this mix. Started off in 9th and ended up in 11th. He did start off on a set of new medium tires, opposed to most people that started off in a used set. I know he was battling, K-Mag for a while and was getting, pushed off and having to deal with, the track limits and giving positions back or not, with K-Mag eventually taking over that position and moving forward, even with Hulkenberg as well. So the bottom 10 were pretty straightforward. Not a lot going on with them. Still trying to figure out with that one, practice session. These lower teams are having a little harder time, dialing it in perfectly of what they need to do. So hopefully with this data that they've gathered, we'll be able to put a little bit more pressure in the full GP race tomorrow. Now we come to the top 10 with Oscar Piastri, who was out of position because of track limits on the qualifying session, getting his time deleted. So he ended up in 16th position to start the sprint race and made his way up to 10th. I have him gaining 2 positions on that first lap. He did get a 5-second penalty forcing Gasly off the track, but made up for that overall by passing Gasly on lap 4 for 13th position, passing Stroll on lap 12, passing Franco Colapinto on lap 13, passing Tsunoda on lap 16 for 10th. So he just kind of worked his way up into that top 10, even though he was just outside the points. A fairly good run. I know he kind of got stuck behind Franco for a little while, but was able to get past him eventually. So that's good for Franco. He's kind of developing his, defensive postures, as well as Oscar trying to figure out how to get around some of these decent drivers that are in the mix as he's moving forward. Sergio Perez didn't qualify as well. Ended up in the 11th spot to start the race. Made his way up to 9th, just shy of points. And I think the Red Bulls are kind of hurting because of that. They're not quite into the point so they can get that extra edge on McLaren for the constructor standings, even though they did shrink the gap a little bit for that, with Oscar being outside the points as well. Sergio Perez did gain 1 position at the start of the race and was able to pass Tsunoda on lap 13 for 9th. So a decent run, but not the great run that we need to see from Sergio Perez. Now we come to both Haas's. They did an awesome job overall, even though Hulkenberg had a little bit of issues at the start of the race. So he qualified in 6th and ended up in 8th. So he had a bad start, kind of dropping 3 spots on that first lap, but then working his way back behind his teammate and was able to kind of play a defensive posture to help protect his teammate and gain them those last 2 point positions. He did pass Tsunoda on lap 7 for that 8th position. So he got there and was able to maintain that with Oscar and Sergio Perez coming up behind them in that run. So it was a good defensive mechanism for Nico Hulkenberg and protecting Kevin and giving the Haas 3 points overall. So excellent job for Hulkenberg. Even though he had a bad start in general, he was able to recover from that and still get the points for Haas. K-Mag qualified in 8th and ended up in 7th. I have him passing Tsunoda back and forth, and then had to regain that position after pushing Tsunoda off, or actually getting pushed off, and then having that position gained through going off the track around Tsunoda, gave it back, was able to retake that position later. So a good fight for Kevin Magnussen, gain that position, getting up to the 7th, gaining two points for Haas. Lewis Hamilton was struggling all weekend. He was unhappy with where they were putting him out in qualifying, thinking it was too early. And then he was complaining about some issues, and I think there were some suspension issues that he was indicating later in the day about his Mercedes, even in the sprint, that he had to follow through the whole sprint race with. And so hopefully they can get that fixed for the GP race, even though he's starting, sounds like, from the back of the field in that GP race. He qualified in 7th, ended up in 6th, gained a position at the very start of the race, and basically maintained that for the rest of the sprint. Kind of maintained it right behind, gaining ground a little bit on his teammate near the end, but not able to pass him. George kind of overcooked his tires, I think. He qualified in 2nd, ended up in 5th. He did a fairly good job at the beginning of the race, putting some pressure, even though he lost some positions. He lost that second position to Lando in that start of the race. He was trying to fight back, really putting some pressure, wore out his front left tire, and then couldn't really maintain the pace after that. And so he ended up allowing the Ferraris by him as well. So that kind of hurt the Mercedes in that run. So if they can figure out what that's going on, I think they'll have a decent job. But he seemed pretty fast at the very beginning. But the tires and issues, I think, just kind of weren't expected on that Mercedes to go off as quickly as they did, which dropped him back into 5th position. Charles Leclerc started off in 3rd, ended up in 4th. He was battling out to his teammate, Carlos Sainz, almost from the very get-go, kind of going back and forth. It was a really spectacular sight. I know he was complaining to his team on the radio, trying to think that they should go settle down and basically go for the people in front of him. He didn't seem to win that, as Carlos was, fought for the rest of that sprint race. Eventually get ahead of, his teammate, Charles Leclerc, and that put him back into that 4th position, but still get decent points for the Ferrari. Now, Lando Norris didn't have quite the qualifying session that he was hoping for, not quite dialed in on that McLaren in those cooler temperatures, and ended up in 4th, but he made his way up to 3rd. He did actually have a really good start and made his way up to that 2nd position on that first quarter, gaining 2 positions, pushing him into that 2nd spot, which he then kind of went through the distance almost, and then ended up getting passed on lap 19 to lose that 2nd position. So really good run for Lando, even though he didn't quite eke it out. I think the tires were wearing off a little faster than he wanted to again, but doing what he can. I know he made that mistake on that last lap that allowed Carlos through, but I'm not sure if Carlos probably could have made it by him. It seems like those Ferraris handled the degradation on those tires a lot better than the rest of the field. and were able to maintain their pace quite significantly above the rest of the field, with the exception of probably Max Verstappen. So for him to maintain third, and I know he was happy with third, even though it did drop him back a little bit more points behind Max in the driver's standing. But a good run for Lando. I thought it was a really good job. Carlos was the star of the day. Probably was the driver of the day, even though I don't think we ever had a official driver of the day for the sprint race. He was qualified in 5th and ended up in 2nd. And I said right off the bat, he was kind of fighting everything. He, was fighting with his teammate Charles Leclerc, going through and eventually passing him on lap 5 for that 4th position, passed George on lap 9 for 3rd position, and passed Norris on lap 19, the very last lap, for that 2nd position. So a really good run from Carlos Sainz, made really exciting, good to watch, really fun to see him battling his teammate and working his way up as well. And then of course Max qualified in 1st, ended up in 1st, didn't really have any kind of fight that he had to put up with. He kind of did a little defensive maneuver at the very beginning of the race, even though I don't think he really needed it. Got the fastest lap of the day near the end of the race. I think it might have been the last lap of the race. So pretty dominant drive for Max. So on lap 5, he was 1.4 seconds ahead of Lando. On lap 10, he was 1.5 seconds ahead of Lando. Lap 15, he was 2.3 seconds ahead of Lando. And then at the very end, he was 3.8 seconds ahead of Carlos Sainz. So a really good run for Max. Really easy to see that he was there. I know there were some mishaps in the qualifying session for the GP race. So I don't think he's going to be able to start on pole, but I kind of foresee that he's going to be able to at least put pressure on that first position throughout the race. So I'll be excited to see what he can do in that GP race. So what did the sprint race actually do to the driver standings? Well, we see Kevin Magnussen jumping up to 15th position ahead of Pierre Gasly with now 8 points. And then, of course, we have the rest of the field in their same order, gaining or losing a few points, with Max Verstappen now with 339 over Lando Norris's 285. So a pretty steady run, kind of putting more pressure on Lando to see if he needs to gain some more points overall, but still that possibility if something drastic happens to Max in one of the races that drops him out. And for the constructor standings, McLaren still maintain the lead with 522 points over Red Bull's 483, even though they lost a little bit of ground there. Ferrari climbing back slightly with 453 points now, so they're still in the running of getting that second position. So we'll have to kind of pay attention to that. And then what the big deal here for this sprint race is that Haas jumped up to 6th position with 34 points, jumping over RB. So we'll have to keep an eye if RB can make some more points and jump back into that 6th position and put that battle for the next 5 or 6 races to see who will actually solidify that 6th position overall in the constructors' standings. So, what did you think of this race? I thought it was a really good sprint race, but what did you think? I know I don't have a whole lot of notes for actions on track, even though it seemed like there was all kinds of actions on track when I was watching it in person. I have to go back and rewatch that, on replay to see if I missed anything else that was super exciting. So what is coming up next? Of course, it's the GP race, and it's tomorrow on October 20th. And it's, of course, the COTA race, though, that's going to have a length of 3.426 miles. And we're going to have 56 laps for a total race distance of 191.634 miles. And, of course, the record holder currently is Charles Leclerc in 2019 with 1 minute 36.169 seconds. And it was introduced in 2012. So if you want to see my post race reaction for the actual GP race, please subscribe or tune in tomorrow and see that upload. Thank you very much and farewell.